Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hi, this is Sonia Torres. I'm here again with Truth in My Days director John Torres, and today we're going to be discussing the last 12 verses of Mark 16. Okay, so John, when reading Mark 16 in the NIV, in chapter 16 after verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. After that, there's this note here. It says, the most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9-20. What's up with that?
Yes, you will see that kind of note in the NIV, and not only in the NIV, where the NIV has that. In fact, in some editions, they have that note, and then everything else in the chapter is put into italics. In the ESV, if you look at that, you will find a similar kind of note right at the end of verse 8 that says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16, 9-20. And it directs you to a footnote that says, some manuscripts end the book with 16:8, others include verses 9-20. If you were looking at the NASB, you see the same kind of thing. You get a little footnote there saying at Mark 16:9, later manuscripts add verses 9-20. And what does it make the person who's reading think when he comes across this? You begin to wonder, well, what's going on here? Are the last 12 verses not authentic? And in fact, that is what the scholars will tell you. Lee Strobel, for example, in The Case for the Real Jesus, writes this. In fact, the whole last 12 verses of Mark were not part of the original gospel, but were added at a later date and are not considered authentic. This means Mark ends with 3 women discovering the empty tomb of Jesus and being told by a young man dressed in a white robe that Jesus had risen from the dead. They said nothing to anyone, concludes the gospel, because they were afraid. That's Lee Strobel. If you listen to Mike Licona, he says this, same book. You'd admit, though, that the final verses in Mark, which describe the resurrection appearances, were not part of the original text. Yes, I believe that's true, he said, but still, Mark clearly knows of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Mark predicts the resurrection in 5 places, and he reports the testimony of the angel to the resurrection, the empty tomb, and the imminent appearance of Jesus in Galilee. In fact, Mark's reference to Peter in Mark 16:7 may be the very same appearance reported in the creed I just mentioned. And Daniel Wallace says this, I think a far better view is that Mark was writing about the most unique individual who has ever lived, and he wanted to format the ending of his gospel in a unique way in which he leaves it open-ended. He's essentially saying to readers, so what are you going to do with Jesus?
Well, but if the most important part that makes him unique, the resurrection isn't there, then why are the readers going to care?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I would ask myself. The problem, you go back a bit, you find here that the scholarly consensus is that the last 12 verses are in fact not authentic. They do not belong to the gospel according to Mark. And when this idea started getting floated widely, which was in the 19th century, the idea was that the original copy of Mark, the last page or the last section had been lost somehow. The last page fell off, scroll was ripped or something, and the original ending of Mark was lost, and this ending was added later. That was the original claim, and that quickly changed until now the scholarly consensus is that no, Mark, there was no original ending to Mark. Mark chose to end his book at 16:8 with the women fleeing from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the end of the book. And then you will have scholars trying to say things like, well, this doesn't matter. We saw Mike Licona saying that, well, Mark clearly knows of the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Mark predicts the resurrection in 5 places. And he reports the testimony of the angel to the resurrection, the empty tomb, and the imminent appearance of Jesus in Galilee. What do you think? Do you think that that's good enough? Then we don't actually need post-resurrection appearances because we have these things.
Well, predicting the resurrection if it didn't actually happen, that doesn't seem so strong. Testimony of the angel, well, maybe that's a bit better. And imminent appearance of Jesus, well, I suppose if he appeared, he must have resurrected.
Well, but what you have here is none of these. There's no appearance of Jesus in Galilee. There's simply this young man who's seen in the tomb saying that he will go before you into Galilee. It doesn't actually happen in Mark if you remove the last 12 verses.
Well, then that's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. I can't believe that a scholar would say this with a straight face. Anybody can predict that, hey, I will die and then I will rise from the dead. It proves nothing.
It has to actually happen.
Exactly. Well, he has predictions in there. So what? There's a young man in a white robe who says, well, yeah, he's not here, he's risen. What would reasonable people think if that's all you have?
Why should you believe the individual in the white robe?
Exactly. You could have just moved the body. That's what I would think. The important point here to note is that no one believed in the resurrection until they saw the risen Jesus. The women did not believe. Mary Magdalene did not believe. Mary Magdalene, you remember that scene of her standing before the tomb and Jesus appears behind her. She doesn't know who it is. Maybe she's not even looking at him. And she says, oh, if you remove the body, tell me where you put it so that I can come and take the body. It's like nobody would believe something like a resurrection from the dead just because somebody predicts it's going to happen. Or just because a guy in a white robe shows up and says, yeah, he rose. Oh, he's going to show up before in Galilee. It is absolutely not enough. The apostles did not believe. When Jesus appeared to the women and actually reported that to the disciples, we're told they did not believe. When he appeared on the road to Emmaus, the two of them, they went and they were not believed either. The apostles were not stupid men. They knew that the dead do not come back. And they did not believe until Jesus appeared to them. And even then, they were still questioning until he said, here, touch me. Put your fingers into the holes in my hands. Put your hand into that big gaping hole in my side where the Roman spear went in. And then he's eating with them. Ghosts don't eat. So right. The idea that, you don't have to have post-resurrection appearances, but that's good enough is just a non-starter. I can't believe they would say that.
Well, could our evangelical scholars think, since we have the resurrection in other gospel books, it doesn't matter that much if it isn't in Mark?
Well, yes, they might think that. It would be a problem, as we'll look into another program, because they also believe that Matthew and Luke simply copied from Mark and from other sources, so they're not independent testimony. Mark, they say, is the first one. So they have the problem. The first one, the one independent one, doesn't have a resurrection.
Oh, that would be a big problem.
That would be a big problem. We'll look into that in more detail. And what about this one, the one that Daniel Wallace has to say? I think a far better view is than Mark. And he means better, like better than actually having an ending, better than actually describing post-resurrection appearances. He says, I think a far better view is that Mark was writing about the most unique individual who has ever lived, and he wanted to format the ending of his gospel in a unique way, in which he leaves it open-ended. He's essentially saying to readers, so what are you going to do with Jesus? What would you say to that?
Well, I say he didn't rise, so we're not going to believe him.
Well, exactly. What are you going to do with Jesus? If there's no post-resurrection appearances, we're going to write him off as another fraud. And rightly so. It makes no sense. So this is the kind of thing they have to say because they believe that the last 12 verses are not authentic. They're a later addition by who knows who. And the question becomes, why is that? Well, it goes back into the mid part of the 19th century. In the mid part of the 19th century, an old copy of the Gospel books, and in fact of the New Testament, was discovered by Lobegot Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf, at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. He was there, I think 1844 was the first time he went there, and he was in a room. The monks were heating the monastery. They had a basket of old manuscripts that they were tossing into the flames to heat the monastery, and he looked at those manuscripts, and some looked old to him. They looked significant. And he plucked them out of the garbage, out of the basket, and I said, wow, these are old manuscripts of the Bible. And he talked to the monks about it. The monks eventually realized, hey, this is valuable to this Westerner here. And they took they took it out of the basket. And Tischendorf made another trip there, and he tried to convince them to turn over the entire manuscript, or what was left of it. And eventually he did get a hold of it. Later it was bought by the British Museum, so you can still see it there. Now, this old manuscript, that dates to about the year 350, we're told, so middle of the 4th century, ends the Gospel according to Mark at verse 8. There is no last 12 verses. Around the same time, we were apprised of another manuscript, another old one, that had been in the Vatican Library for quite a while, but not publicized. Now they publicized it, and this was called Codex Vaticanus. The one Tischendorf found has been called Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Vaticanus also is missing the last 12 verses of Mark. Now, there are these two manuscripts missing the last 12 verses of Mark, yes. But they're the only two manuscripts of Mark that are missing the last 12 verses.
One of which is found in the garbage.
One of which, was found in the garbage. But here's the thing. How many manuscripts of Mark do we have? 16 or 1700. And every one of them has these. We're told there's one 12th century minuscule manuscript that's missing it, but that's no longer counted because they found that was actually a commentary where they would quote a part of the text, Bible text, give some commentary, quote the next chapter, and so on. And that one doesn't have the last 12 verses either, but it's clear that that's not a complete manuscript. So we don't have the end of it. So really, there are only these two that are missing it. And on that basis, liberal scholars began to say, well, we should take these as the best manuscripts and admit that the last 12 verses are inauthentic, you see, because this is just too good an opportunity for liberal scholars. Remember, we've talked about this. Liberal scholarship was all about discrediting the Bible. And this was a golden opportunity for them to argue that Mark didn't actually include a resurrection of Jesus. That Mark ended his account with women fleeing, saying nothing to anyone, and that was that. There was no actual resurrection.
Well, even if we've got thousands of manuscripts that do include the last 12 verses, if these two which don't include are older, does that outweigh the importance of the other thousands?
No, it doesn't. You can see our article on the website on this issue. You can show through statistical analysis that there's no way what's called a secondary reading, one that's not original, one that will be added later, could ever come to dominate the manuscript tradition. It's just not possible that you would have 1,698 out of 1,700 manuscripts with this reading if they were not original. Furthermore, it's not just that. You have to look also at the quality of the manuscripts. Why were the monks tossing this one? Is it because it's not a good manuscript? Indeed, it isn't. When these two came to the fore, yes, they were the oldest we had at the time, mid-4th century, about 350 for Sinaiticus. We're told Vaticanus is perhaps a little earlier, about 325. And we're told these are the best, the earliest and the best manuscripts. Remember that note in the NIV?
Yeah.
What did it say?
The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9-20.
Yeah, most reliable. It was essential. If you want to get rid of the resurrection, you have to get rid of the last 12 verses of Mark. You have to argue these are the most reliable manuscripts. The problem is they're not. When you're looking at the quality of manuscripts, how close it is to the original is one factor, but a much more important factor is how careful the scribe was. You could have a scribe copy a manuscript very carefully, and then another scribe copy that very carefully, and another scribe copy that very carefully, and another scribe copy that very carefully. And what you'd have at the end would still be very, very close to the original. You can have one scribe copy the original very carelessly, and it's going to deviate more than that other one, just out of carelessness. So the question is, these two manuscripts, which we're told are the most reliable, the best manuscripts, is that true? That's crucial to the issue. And scholars don't want to talk about that. They don't want to deal with that issue. In point of fact, they are terribly careless. They're terribly carelessly copied. Dean John Bergen in the latter part of the 19th century went through manuscripts. This is what he found about Codex Vaticanus. Whereas Codex Vaticanus omits words or whole clauses 1,491 times in the Gospel accounts alone and is disfigured throughout with repetitions. Codex Sinaiticus abounds with errors of the eye and pen. On many occasions, 10, 20, 30, 40 words are dropped through very carelessness. Letters and words, even whole sentences, are frequently written twice over or begin and immediately cancelled, while that gross blunder, whereby a clause is omitted because it happens to end in the same words as the clause preceding, occurs no less than 115 times in the New Testament.
Well, it's bad enough to omit a clause, but even a very careless scribe like that, could he possibly miss a whole 12 verses?
Well, we'll get back to the missing 12 verses as well, but the point is, when you're talking about most reliable manuscripts, these are not reliable. Absolutely not. Another scholar named Hermann Hoskier, in the early part of the 20th century, he decided to compare these two side by side and flag all the differences between them. He left out trivial things like spelling mistakes. And he thought that, well, there aren't that many. You quickly get through this, and that would be that. And just to help us out, he was going to go through the entire New Testament. He didn't. In the end, he made it only through the gospel books. He filled 2 huge volumes of differences. These 2 manuscripts in the gospel books alone contradict each other over 3,000 times.
So there's no way that both of them could be the most reliable.
Yeah, 3,036 to be precise. Yes, they cannot. Either one is perfect, and the other one is terrible, or the first is terrible, the other one's perfect, or they're both terrible. But as we see from Bergen's analysis, both of them are terrible. And that's not all, because if you look back at the manuscripts, their testimony against the last 12 verses is very questionable. When you go through the New Testament in Codex Vaticanus, what you see is there's 3 columns. On each sheet of vellum, there are 3 columns of text. And throughout the entire New Testament, the scribe follows this practice where he writes the first column, then he moves to the middle of the page, writes down the second column. He'll move to the right side page, write down the third column, and he'll keep doing that. When he reaches the end of a book, say he's in the middle of a column as a center column, he reaches the end of the book, then he moves to the top of the very next column and starts the next book. There's one and only one place in Codex Vaticanus where he deviates from this practice, and that's at the end of the Gospel according to Mark, where he reaches the end of the book partway down the middle column, and then instead of moving to the top of the right-hand column to start Luke, he leaves an entire blank column. And then moves to the next page to start Luke.
So it's like he was saving space for something.
Well, he was saving space for something, and that raises the question, what was he saving the space for? It's the only place in the whole book where he did it, and the only good explanation anybody's ever come up with is that he knew that his exemplar, that is the manuscript he was copying, was missing something. Perhaps that page of Mark with the last 12 verses had come loose, had gotten lost somehow. But seemingly he knew that Mark was not finished, and he left space to add those verses later, and somehow never got around to doing it. But this is very much a mixed testimony against the last 12 verses, unless you can come up with another explanation for why the scribe left a blank column. Codex Sinaiticus is even more suspicious, because in Codex Sinaiticus, what you have here is the original pages that included the end of Mark were removed. We don't have the original pages that include the end of Mark. For some reason, somebody at a later state removed them.
How can you tell that they were removed? Is there a note saying so?
No, but the vellum is different, the writing is different. It's very, very noticeable. There's no question about it. Nobody questions this. And here's the interesting thing about the change. Apparently the scribe did not want to get into the same problem that the scribe of Vaticanus had, where he left a blank column. He wanted to hide the fact that there's a blank column. Because here what he did is he's writing the end of Mark, and he realizes there's going to be a blank column, which suggests, how would there be a blank column if you include the last 12 verses? It would suggest the exemplar he was copying from had the last 12 verses. He didn't want to have the last 12 verses in there, but he didn't want to leave a blank column there to show it. So you can look at his handwriting, and at the top, he's got the same size letters, same kind of font size, so to speak, as he has before that. But as he's moving down the page, you see he's stretching out the font size.
So you think that the scribe purposely, he knew that there were those last 12 verses supposed to be there and purposely deleted them?
Well, once again, what other explanation is there for this?
Well, I remember hearing that scribes were very loath to change the text and that there was something called an inscriptional curse.
Yes, they were very low. That's why it's a very rare thing. And that's why you really only have this one example in the entire corpus of the manuscripts of Mark. Okay? Loath doesn't mean that for some reason they may not do it. It means that's so rare that such a thing is never going to dominate the manuscript tradition. Vaticanus, as we see, the scribe doesn't seem to have been trying to change it. He just didn't have access to the last 12 verses when he copied his, but he left space for it. Sinaiticus is the only one where you do have this. But again, if that's not the reason, you have to explain why does he follow the normal font. But then he realizes if he keeps writing with the normal font, he's going to end up with a blank column, which he doesn't want. So he starts stretching out the font enough so that he can have a few lines to put in the next column, take you to the end of verse 8, and then just writes a little blurb in the rest of it, and then that's it. We don't know what the original text of Sinaiticus actually had. We only know what this later substitution had, which itself looks very suspicious.
So the blurb doesn't give any clues?
No, it doesn't. It's almost like, again, just trying to hide the fact that, hey, we have a blank column here. So that's the testimony against it. Now, the scholars will try to bring up as much evidence as they can against it. And they have a problem there. Some of this isn't even honest. They will try to cite church fathers as witnesses against this. They'll see in that list, who are these?
Clement, Origen, Eusebius.
Clement and Origen, for example, so they say, these are witnesses against the last 12 verses of Mark. Why are they witnesses against the last 12 verses of Mark? Well, we're told they never mention it.
Doesn't mean they're not there.
Well, exactly.
What if they're not talking about that subject?
Exactly. One of them doesn't quote from the entire last chapter of Matthew either. Does that mean that the last chapter of Matthew is not there? That's not honest. It really isn't.
Is there any church father who says that, the last 12 verses of Mark are false?
No. Quite the opposite, as we will see. Let's go through the evidence for and against these last 12 verses. The claim is made that the earliest and best manuscripts of Mark, which are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, are missing the last 12 verses. Every once in a while, they'll bring up Codex 304 from the 12th century. We've explained why that doesn't really count. The reality is that it's present in about 1,700 manuscripts, absent only in those two, and their testimony is questionable. That's as far as the manuscripts go. Now, the lectionaries. Now, I think we mentioned this in another program. A lectionary is a text of the gospel books that are not written necessarily in the order in which you find them in the actual original books. They're sections copied down to read in church services. They're called lectionaries. And the lectionaries, all of them have it, the last 12 verses of Mark.
About how many lectionaries do we have?
Hundreds minimum. I've heard 2,000 actually. I don't know if that's correct, but definitely hundreds. The versions. Now, by versions we mean the ancient translations into other languages. they will boast that, oh, Old Latin. That's supposed to be one of the earliest translations. They say the last 12 verses are missing in the Old Latin Codex Bobiensis. The reality is, yes, it's missing from Codex Bobiensis. It's in every other Latin manuscript, of which we have a good 8,000. We're told that the last 12 verses are missing in the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript. Yes, it is. About 1,001 Syriac manuscripts is missing in one and present in 1,000 of them. We are told that it is missing in about 100 Armenian manuscripts. Yes, but it is present in the large majority of them. And furthermore, the earliest Armenian manuscript is from the year AD 887, too late to be significant. Okay, so the attempt to claim that the versions are against the last 12 verses is really not correct.
Okay, but isn't it a coincidence of all those different versions? If they're missing something, they all happen to be missing that same passage.
Oh, they're missing other things as well. But here's the thing. Isn't it a coincidence that almost all of them have it? Is it easier to think that one copyist missed it, or perhaps one copyist was using a Greek text missing it, like Codex Vaticanus? Or is it more reasonable to think that one guy got it right and everybody else added in a new ending that just happens to match?
Oh, yeah, I guess.
So we go to the church fathers there. Now, so we see they claim that Clement, Origen, Eusebius, and so on are against it. That's in the third edition of the United Bible Society's Greek text. By the fourth edition, they dropped Clement and Origen, because as I pointed out, they're not witnesses against it at all. They also dropped Ammonius, they dropped Victor, they dropped Euthemius. These people that had previously been cited as witnesses against the authenticity of Mark 69, it never were. They were shanghaied as witnesses trying to add support for it, but they're not. Eusebius, for example, Eusebius explicitly quotes verses from this passage. So, let's look some more. Now, you ask, shouldn't we go by the earliest evidence? Okay, which is a good question. It's not necessarily correct, because let me put it this way. There's an auto accident, and you have 102 people witnessing the auto accident. And 100 of them say that the guy in the back rear-ended the woman in front. 2 guys say, no, the woman in front backed her car into the guy behind. 100 against 2. Who are you going to go with?
100.
But suppose the 100 were 20 feet away and the 2 were 10 feet away. Then who are you going to believe?
Oh, I guess the 2.
Would
They're
you?
in a position to see it better.
Really? So 100 people from 20 feet away can't see it? Would you actually go with the 2?
Well, I don't know, especially the 100 people, they might be blocked by each other.
Some might be blocked by each other, but they say they saw it. But let's add this now. Those 2 start saying, yeah, the woman backed into the guy behind her. And one of the 2 says, yeah, she pulled out of her driveway and plowed into him. And the other guy says, no, she was across the street and pulled into him. And the first guy says, yeah, she couldn't see because she was wearing sunglasses. And the other guy says, no, she wasn't wearing sunglasses. One after another, their testimony begins to contradict each other. You begin to suspect these people are not very reliable witnesses. Would you still go with those 2?
No.
So there we go. We have these 2, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, who are closer, though not by that much. We have the long ending in Codex Washingtonianus, which is late 4th century, so not that much further. We have 1700, not 100, testifying to it. The 2 who are closer also are contradicting each other, though right and left. However, if we want the earliest evidence, let's look at the Church Fathers. Because the Church Fathers, when it comes to the actual specific wording of the text, of course you want to go with the actual manuscripts, but when it comes to whether something is there or not, the Church Fathers are extremely important evidence, particularly since we know the dates for them, generally, so we know when they were writing this. Very important Church Father Irenaeus, and we've mentioned him before. He was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John. Writing around the year 180, He actually quotes Mark 16:19. This is what he writes in Against Heresies 3.10.5. Also, towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, "So then after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sitteth on the right hand of God." Now that's an exact quote from Mark 16:19. So when Irenaeus says that, does that mean that the manuscripts of Mark he has, does that include the last 12 verses or no?
Well, it at least includes up to 19 anyway.
Well, yes, so it'll include that last section. Certainly it has post-resurrection appearances. Now, look at the date, 180. Codex Sinaiticus 325, which is the earlier evidence. Irenaeus by far. Now, Tatian, we've mentioned Tatian before. Tatian wrote the first Gospel Harmony, where he takes the 4 gospel accounts and stitches them together into one continuous account on year 170, maybe 175. In his Diatessaron, he includes the last 12 verses of Mark. So here's his date. He's even earlier than Irenaeus. 170, 175. What was the date of Codex Vaticanus?
We say 300 something.
325. Codex Sinaiticus 350. Which is the earlier evidence?
Tatian.
There you go. And there are other ones as well who quote from the last 12 verses long before those 2 corrupt manuscripts came along. So if we're looking at what's the earliest evidence, we know as far back as we can trace the church fathers, which is into the 2nd century, it was there. So 2 manuscripts in the 4th century that omit it cannot override the testimony of fathers from the 2nd century who are quoting from it. So there's no really intellectually honest way to deny that the last 12 verses are authentic. You certainly, all they have are those 2 4th century manuscripts, which right on the face of it are not reliable. And as we've said, their testimony is already questionable. Now, you do find in some very small number of manuscripts, you will have another ending. And this is, but they reported briefly to those with Peter all that had been commanded them. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from the east even to the west the sacred and incorruptible message of eternal salvation. Now, they would say that, oh, see, this proves the last 12 verses are not authentic. But the reality is that the manuscripts that have this also have the last 12 verses. And they're late. The manuscripts that have both of these, Codex L from the 8th century, Codex C from the 9th or 10th centuries, Codex 83 from the 6th, 7th century, Codex 99 from the 7th century, Codex 274 from the 10th century has it in the margin, and then 579 in the 13th century.
Well, where did this other extra content come from?
Well, the fact that it's in the margin in 274 suggests that some scribe at some point wrote this as a marginal note.
Oh, and then some other scribe thought it was actually part of the text.
Yes, that happens on occasion, but rarely, which is why it's only in a very small number of manuscripts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, along with Codex Bobiensis. So there you go. It's the fact that there's this other ending really doesn't change the fact that the last 12 verses are authentic, because the manuscripts have the last 12 verses along with this. Now, even the most flagrant liberal textual critic will admit that if we went only by the so-called external evidence, the manuscripts, the church fathers' quotations, we would have to admit that the last 12 verses are authentic. But they really, really, really don't want that, because it destroys this opportunity to undermine the resurrection. So they switch to internal evidence. They try to claim that the vocabulary and the style of the last 12 verses of Mark are non-Markan. What would that mean, non-Markan?
Well, he doesn't use those words or grammatical constructions in other parts of Mark.
That's what they would try to say. They would point out that there are 17 words in this passage that are found nowhere else in Mark. They will say the distinctively Markan word euthus, immediately, is absent.
Maybe something immediately didn't happen in the last 12 verses.
Could be, yeah. The distinctively Markan word palin, again, is absent. The historic present is absent. What is the historic present, Sonia?
It's when the present tense is used to describe events that happened in the past to give a sense of vividness.
Yeah, so we do that in English as well. We would say something like, oh, yesterday I went to the store and I was in there and this this guy comes up to me and he says, see, I've switched to the present.
But it's still clear that you're narrating something that happened in the past.
Yeah. So they'll say the historic present is absent. We don't have that in the last 12 verses. De is used as the main unit connector, whereas Mark prefers kai. And they will say that each of these by itself may not mean much, but the combination proves inauthenticity. What would you say to that? Does that sound reasonable to you?
Well, look, even when the writer uses a historic present, he doesn't use it all the time. And, well, des is a very common word. Just because Mark prefers kai doesn't mean he never used de.
Mm-hmm. So does it sound convincing to you then?
No.
Any one of these?
No.
Does the combination together sound as if it proves anything?
Well, no, because they all seem pretty trivial. So trivial that even if you added them together, the combination doesn't mean much either. And also, 12 verses, it just doesn't seem to be a very big sample size anyway.
Exactly. And here's one of the big problems with Bible scholars and textual critics. They have no idea of statistical analysis. It's not part of their training. And unfortunately, the mathematics does matter. It does have to come into consideration. Humans use language with all kinds of different vocabulary, different styles, depending on the purposes. The stories I made up to tell you girls when you were kids is not the same as the vocabulary and style you use in a sermon, which is not the same as the vocabulary and style that I would use in one of my articles for the website. And so here's the thing. Because of the variability, it takes a huge sample before you can draw any kind of conclusion about authenticity. G. Udney Ewell, who was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest statistician, mathematician in these areas in the 20th century, wrote a book on this, and he concluded that it takes a minimum sample of 10,000 words for you to try to establish any kind of claims about authorship on the basis of style or vocabulary. And the last 12 verses of Mark are very, very much less than 10,000 words. But we can illustrate how bogus this kind of argument is. Let's take some other 12-verse units or 9, 10-verse units from Mark. Look at Mark 1, 2 to 11, Mark 9, 42 to 50, Mark 12, 1 to 11, Mark 13, 14 to 23, Mark 14, 1 to 9, Mark 15, 42 to 16, 5, and then our Mark 16, 9 to 20. Now, the skeptics will tell you that there's 17 non-Markan words in those 12 verses that prove it's not authentic. Really? Mark 1, 2 to 11, is it authentic? Nobody questions it. It has 17 so-called non-Markan words. Where's that on appear else in Mark? 9, 42 to 50, does anybody question it? No. It has 17 non-Markan words. Our passage from chapter 12 has 19 non-Markan words. Our passage from chapter 13 has 15. Our passage from chapter 14 has 20 non-Markan words. So does the presence of 17 so-called non-Markan words in 16, 9 to 20, does that prove anything?
No.
No, obviously not. This characteristic word, euthus, it's distinctively Markan. It should be there if this were authentic, right? We go through our passages. Chapter 1, euthus appears once. Our passage from chapter 9, it doesn't appear at all. Our passage from chapter 12 doesn't appear at all. Our passage from chapter 13 doesn't appear at all. Our passage from chapter 14 doesn't appear at all. Our passage from chapter 15 doesn't appear at all. By the liberals' reasoning, all of these passages should be considered inauthentic, and none of them is.
Well, unless there's the combo. What about Palin?
Well, look, okay, what about Palin? Same thing, look through our passages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other passages besides Mark 16. In the 6 passages, it appears once in our passage from chapter 12. It doesn't appear in chapter 1 passage, our chapter 9 passage, our chapter 13 passage, our chapter 14 passage, and our chapter 15 passage. The historic present, what's used twice in 1542 to 16:5, it's not used in any other of the passages. So we're left with kai and de. That's the only one left, and that's obviously not enough to base any kind of conclusion on. But the claim is that de is used as the main unit connector, whereas Mark prefers kai. So you should have more kais than de. Well, in Mark 16, 9 to 20, you have 9 or 10 kais, 5 or 6 des. So you do have more kais. So here's the thing. People will make these claims. And even people in seminary will sit in class, they will hear these claims, they will not bother to check for themselves. They will hear the claims and say, oh yeah, it's not authentic, and they will pass it on. Not one of them bothers to do the research. Not one of them bothers to find out how many words you'd actually need in a passage to make judgments about authenticity. Not one of them sits down and bothers to count. Well, how many unique words are there in other 12 verse passages? How many times does Euthus appear in those? How many times does Palin appear in those? How many times does historic? They don't bother to check. They simply hear the claims that liberals have put together, and they accept it without question. And that's a big problem. Then they will try other claims. One writes this: the connection between verse 8 and verses 9 to 20 is so awkward that it is difficult to believe that the evangelist intended the section to be a continuation of the gospel. Thus, the subject of verse 8 is the women, whereas Jesus is the presumed subject in verse 9. In verse 9, Mary Magdalene is identified, even though she had been mentioned only a few lines before, 1547 and 16:1. The other women of verses 1 to 8 are now forgotten. The use of Anastas de and the position of proton are appropriate at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative, but they're ill-suited in the continuation of verses 1 to 8. Now, you, Sonia, you're a Greek scholar. What do you think of these arguments?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is if the last 12 verses are supposed to be a fake that's inserted later, you'd think that whoever inserted them would purposely not try to make it awkward.
That's the first thing that struck me as well. You would think that if the connection is awkward, as they claim, that would speak against this being inauthentic, because you would think somebody making up an ending, trying to slide it in, looking as if it's authentic ending, would be extra careful to make it smooth. Right? So, good. You picked up on that right away. What else?
I'm not really aware of any problem with putting the participle at the beginning or putting proton at the beginning just because it's a continuation of verses 1 to 8. I'm not aware that that's any kind of issue.
Yeah, and you're right. There isn't. But let's continue. This is from Bruce Metzger, by the way, a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. In short, he says, all these features indicate that the section was added by someone who knew a form of mark that ended abruptly with verse 8 and who wished to supply a more appropriate conclusion. In view of the inconsistencies between verses 1 to 8 and 9 to 20, it is unlikely that the long ending was composed ad hoc to fill up an obvious gap. It is more likely that the section was excerpted from another document dating perhaps from the first half of the 2nd century. Any comments on that?
Okay, even if they were too lazy to make up their own last 12 verses and just plagiarized from another one, you'd think that they'd still change around the awkward connection.
Certainly. And notice again, dating perhaps from the first half of the 2nd century. This is so typical in liberal biblical scholarship, where they'll make a statement like that and expect you to accept it on the basis that, hey, I have a PhD. What evidence would there be that this other document was taken from the first half of the 2nd century?
It sounds like they just made it up.
They just made it up. They just throw that idea out and you're supposed to accept it. Yeah? But you have to put it into the 2nd century, of course, because you want the resurrection to be a legend. So, is there anything to these arguments? Well, let's look at the arguments one by one. They say the subject of verse 8 is the women, whereas Jesus is the presumed subject in verse 9. Well, yes, verse 8 is finishing the passage about the women in the tomb. The young man tells them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Well, so verse 8 is finishing this account of the women in the tomb, and verse 9 tells us that Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Well, so now the topic has switched to Jesus.
How's that a problem?
Well, I don't know, but according to Metzger, the subject of verse 8 is the women, whereas Jesus is the presumed subject in verse 9. He says it's a problem. I'm not seeing the problem. The only thing I can imagine that he wants to see as a problem is that verse 9 is Jesus it doesn't say his name. It says when he rose, or on the first day. So it switches subject without naming Jesus specifically, as if the context didn't somehow make it clear nobody else rose. Right? The young man said, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, he is risen. Verse 9, now when he rose. Well, so is it clear in the context who we're talking about?
Yeah.
I would think so. And as you read through Mark, you do find this stylistic thing that he often has conversations between two people or events between two people where he switches from one to another without specifying the name. It does happen. But here, because of the wording, Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified, he has risen. Now when he rose, well, so this is not an issue at all. The context is very clear what he's talking about. In verse 9, Mary Magdalene is identified even though she has been mentioned only a few lines before, 1547 and 16:1. Now, this one's very strange here. Here, Metzger thinks Mary should not have been identified because she was mentioned 8 verses earlier. I mean, they said her name 8 verses earlier. Why are you identifying her?
Well, okay, let's see. 8 verses earlier looks like they identified her, and they identified the other Mary too, as if to distinguish them. So then when they're mentioning her again,
16:1.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James. So then in verse 9, if they're going to mention a Mary again, well, which one is it? Of course, they have to say which one, Mary Magdalene.
Yeah. So Metzger thinks Mary should not have been identified because she was mentioned 8 verses earlier. Whereas in the previous point, he complains that Jesus should have been identified even though it was mentioned 3 verses earlier. How does that fit? Okay. I wonder if he's even listening to himself, because he points out that Mary was identified in 1547, one verse before being identified in 16:1.
Also, again, in 47, it's in the same sense as Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of somebody, Joseph. So, of course, they have to identify her to distinguish her from the other one.
Well, exactly. 1547, 16:1, she's mentioned as a group of women. In this verse, he's telling us who he appeared to first. What should he put in there? First, appeared to her first? Her? Just say her? Like, he mentioned groups of women before. Just saying her wouldn't tell who he appeared to first. He has to mention her by name here. So what kind of argument is this? It just makes no sense. The use of anastas de and the position of proton first are appropriate at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative, but they're ill-suited in the continuation of verses 1 to 8. Now, this is complete rubbish. Okay? Proton first appears 38 times in the narrative portions of the New Testament. This is Gospel, Books, and Acts. 37 of those times it is not at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. So he's telling us that, proton is ill-suited to continuation. It should be at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative, whereas 37 out of 38 times it's used in the gospel is not at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. So where do you get the claim that that's where it should fit?
Made up.
Yeah. But again, who checks? They'll read this argument from Metz and say, well, that makes sense. How many of them bother to look at where proton is used and see whether it's really true that they are appropriate at the beginning of a narrative, ill-suited in a continuation of a narrative? Because if they check, they would see. Anastasa, having risen, okay? It should be at the beginning of a comprehensive narrative. It shouldn't be in the continuation. But I would ask, doesn't it have to go at that part of the narrative where he is risen?
Well, I don't know.
Which is not at the beginning of the narrative?
Maybe they're not talking about the fact that means risen. Maybe he's referring to the aorist participle with de or something like that.
No. He's clearly talking about where it is in the narrative, not the grammatical form. What else? Okay. The other women of verses 1 to 8 are now forgotten. Well, what does it say in Mark 16:9? He appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Well, he didn't appear first to the other women. So that's why they're now, quote unquote, forgotten. Does that make, again, any sense? No. And yet this is what takes in so many evangelicals. So there you go. There's no internal or external evidence against the authenticity of these last 12 verses. In fact, the evidence, particularly the external evidence, the evidence of the manuscripts, the evidence of the church fathers, is conclusive. There's no real valid way to deny the last 12 verses, but liberal scholars insist that they must be out. And as I've said, unfortunately, too many in fact, most evangelical scholars go along with this. They just don't bother to examine the facts carefully themselves. They hear these kind of arguments, they accept them, they regurgitate them, and they don't do due diligence on examining these claims, as we have done. For example, one popular ministry, Creation Ministries International, their New Testament specialist, says this: the long ending, and by that she means the last 12 verses, the long ending seems cobbled together from the other Gospels and Acts. The road to Emmaus appearance is taken from Luke. The appearance to the 11 and the Great Commission are similarly from the other Gospels. The driving out demons could come from one of the commissioning of the disciples. And immunity to poison and snake bites could be an allusion to Paul's survival of the snake bite in Acts. The command about baptism has frequently been mishandled by some who commit a logical fallacy. So there's no material in the long ending that we don't have elsewhere.
But you don't have that combination elsewhere.
No, you don't have that combination elsewhere. But otherwise, does this sound like a good argument?
Well, unless she wants to think that in all the other places where the Gospels talk about the same event, that one must have taken it from somewhere else or from the other.
Yes, it's an extreme example of what's called literary dependence, which is something we'll look at in another program, is also something quite damaging to the credibility of the gospel books. But here's the thing. If these are historical events, which they are, and 4 different people wrote about them, wouldn't you expect that the different elements are spread among the 4 writers?
Yeah, doesn't that even happen with today's newspapers too?
Well, exactly. This is why there's no material in the long ending that we don't have elsewhere. Even if that were true, it would be irrelevant. It's because they're all describing the same historical events, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, the idea is that, well, as long as you have similar events, as you said, it means that one person wrote it and the other writers got it from that one person. Like that does not make sense. And some of these are really stretching it. Immunity to poison and snake bites could be an allusion to Paul's survival of the snake bite in Acts. Does that sound at all similar?
Not really.
No, not at all, in fact. If you look at what's in Mark chapter 16, in that passage, now it's a bit cryptic, but what it says is, he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Okay, so he got that from Matthew. Well, I mean, if that's what Jesus said, that's where Peter got it from, and Mark wrote down what Peter remembered. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will follow those who believe in my name. They will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents. Okay? And if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. So,
where's the part about this actual snake bite?
There's nothing about snake bite. It simply says they will take up serpents, period. It says nothing about what will happen to them. And then another point, if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. So there's an account in Acts where Paul's, this is during one of the shipwrecks, I think, and he's building, I think, a fire, and a serpent comes out and latches onto his arm, and the locals think, oh, this proves Paul's a bad guy, he's going to die from the snake bite, and he just shakes off the snake, he doesn't die.
That's not exactly taking up a serpent. It's not being attacked by one, and he happened to survive because God protected him.
Yeah, it's not at all that. And where's immunity to poison in that?
Well, maybe the poison from the snake bite, but then, of course, in Mark is categorized separately.
Not just that. Snakes don't have poison. Snakes have venom. It says here in Mark, if they drink anything deadly.
Oh, and you never drink the snake venom.
And if you did drink snake venom, it wouldn't do anything to you. Venom has to get into your bloodstream to do anything to you. Unless you have some kind of cut inside your esophagus, you can drink snake venom, it won't do anything to you. So The incident of Paul and the snake is not where this thing about drinking poison will not hurt you came from. This passage does sometimes confuse Christians because they assume that every one of these powers, so to speak, is given to every Christian. Whereas I think the way Jesus worded it is these are signs that follow the disciples as a whole. So this will be done by some disciples, this will be done by others, this might be done by only one, and so on. It's the signs. Because we see at the end of Mark, after he ascends, it says that Jesus was working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. So he's picking and choosing signs to do through different disciples. This is not like every single disciple can drink poison and it doesn't hurt him. So that's a misunderstanding. And if we understand that, then it's not such a mysterious passage anymore. The part about taking up serpents is interesting because the word for take up, airo, can mean to take up, but it can also mean take up, take away, remove, and even against the will of somebody. Serpents is sometimes used as a symbol of evil powers. Even Satan is a serpent, it is not a literal snake. So taking up or taking away could be a reference to removing the power of the enemy, pushing it aside. And there's an interesting passage in Luke chapter 10, verse 19, where Jesus says, "Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." So there's similarities here with what we have in Mark 16. And so by the reasoning of this New Testament specialist, Luke 19 must have been cobbled together by somebody else, and it isn't. Okay, so this could simply be a reference, the same idea. It's trampling, taking up, taking away the power of the enemy. So that just makes no sense. The idea that there's no material in the long ending that we don't have elsewhere. If that were true, would it be important?
If there were some in Mark that you didn't have elsewhere.
If there's no material in the long ending that we don't have elsewhere, would that be significant?
No.
No. Let's look at the account of the feeding of the 5,000, for example. It's one of the very few miracles that occur in all of the gospel books. Feeding of the 5,000. Now, if you look at the account in Matthew, you go through the account in Matthew, which was the first gospel book written, you will not find one detail in there that's not also in Mark or Luke or John. Okay? So there's no material in Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000 that we don't have elsewhere. Would we then conclude that account was not written by Matthew, was added later by somebody who cobbled it together from other accounts? Will we conclude that?
Well, we wouldn't, but I guess the liberals would think it all comes from Q or whatever.
Perhaps, but I don't think they would jump on Matthew's account of the feeding the 5,000 and say this is secondary, because they know it's part of the original text. But it shows how useless this kind of argument is. Absolutely useless, and I'm surprised it would be advanced. And that's even if it were true. And it's not true. There are details in here. In fact, there is at least one detail in the last 12 verses of Mark that isn't in Matthew, Luke, or John, and it is a very important one. If you read here, this is in Mark 16. This is after Jesus has appeared to the women. He's appeared to the two disciples walking elsewhere. And then we read in verse 14. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table and rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. So here it tells us that Jesus actually rebuked the people. He rebuked his disciples. It doesn't say that in Matthew or in Mark or in Luke. And that's a very important detail.
Why is it so important?
I'll tell you why it's important. This is in Mark, and this is in the part that's considered authentic. In verse 7, the young man in the tomb says to the women, "Go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you." And if you look at the account in Matthew, it goes through Jesus meeting the women, telling them to tell the disciples, and we have the same message. Jesus said to them, this is Matthew 28:10, Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And then there's the account of what happened when the tomb guards went to the Jewish leaders and were bribed to lie about what happened to the body. And then it continues in verse 16. Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. Now, there are liberal skeptics, and in fact, one of my professors at OTS when I was there would say this is an irreconcilable contradiction. Jesus' disciples, according to Matthew, met him in Galilee, but elsewhere it looks like they're meeting in Jerusalem. So that's a contradiction.
Could they not have met more than once?
Well, they clearly met more than once. We read in Acts that Jesus appeared alive to them, showing himself alive by many infallible proofs across 40 days.
Then how is it an irreconcilable contradiction?
Well, these liberal skeptics want to argue that no, there was only one point at which Jesus appeared to them. It's only one time, one place, one appearance, and all the others should be subsumed into one. It's not surprising that they want to say that, because they're going to try to go with some kind of hallucination explanation for the resurrection, and that's not going to work if Jesus is appearing many times in many places. But they will say this is a contradiction, because Jesus told them go to Galilee, and Matthew asked them going to Galilee, that they see him. What's happening? Why is he in Jerusalem meeting them in Mark? But the explanation actually is very, very simple. The message from the angel was go to Galilee, there you will see him. They didn't believe it. They didn't go. They stayed in Jerusalem, right?
So that would be why they're rebuked.
Exactly. That's why Jesus had to appear to them in Jerusalem. Even though he intended that they should go to Galilee, he would appear there. They didn't go. And so Jesus has to appear to them in Jerusalem, and that's why he rebukes them for their unbelief. And you see that clearly in Mark, but you don't see that elsewhere. So yes, indeed, there are details here that aren't elsewhere, and they're important. They're important. So besides this, you have few attempts to make further arguments against this. An argument from style, they will say that, the action here, if you look at the last 12 verses, the action is hurried with a lot squeezed into a few verses. I'm not sure why it can't be that way, why that would prove that is written later. But we can also point out that the Gospel according to Mark starts that way also. If you look at the first 15 verses, that's exactly what you have. Action is hurried, a lot squeezed into a few verses. It came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately coming up from the water, he saw the heavens parting and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. Then a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Immediately the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. Now after John was put in prison, Jesus came to Galilee, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God, and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." So in these 15 verses, we see action very much compressed, hurried, a lot squeezed into a few verses. And nobody wants to suggest that the first 15 verses of Mark are not part of the original and were added later. So that kind of argument brought against the last 12 verses is no more valid. So what can we conclude from all this? Well, we conclude, according to all of the evidence, Mark 16, 9-20 is the original end of the gospel according to Mark, as written by Mark himself. Remember that out of the 1,700 or so manuscripts of the Gospel according to Mark, there is not even one that is a clear witness against the last 12 verses. The two that are touted as the most reliable manuscripts are anything but the most reliable. We remember that the earliest evidence is the patristic testimony, including Irenaeus and Tatian's Diatessaron, which shows that Mark 16, 9-20 was part of the Gospel almost 200 years before these two codices were written, the ones that omit them. We point out that the evidence of the version solidly supports the authenticity of the last 12 verses. We've seen that the arguments from internal evidence are demonstrably bogus. And so we come back to the fact that the driving force behind the push to deny the authenticity of the last 12 verses of the Gospel according to Mark is to facilitate the denial of the resurrection of Christ. And I think we touched on that, but we'll get into more details in a later program. And the final point is then it's very regrettable that the vast majority of evangelical scholars continue to follow the liberal lead in this matter in denying the authenticity of this passage and bringing with it disastrous consequences. Any final comments, Sonia?
Well, John, what are those seminaries doing? It's just terrible. Thanks for clearing this all up, and let it be a lesson. We must always do due diligence and not just follow what we hear blindly.
Indeed we must. Thank you, Sonia. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com.